So I'll now move on to our last speaker, Seán Binder, who has been at the front line, really, of attempts by NGO save and rescue teams to stop this equivalent genocide in the Mediterranean. He's currently facing criminal charges in Greece for assisting migrants and for saving lives. So over to you, Seán.
Thank you, Wendy. Can you all hear me? Is this okay? Yeah, great. I want to discuss the phenomenon of criminalisation of humanitarianism, as was already mentioned. I'm a law student and I've been a litigation researcher for the EU-funded Platform for Migration, Asylum and Integration, or RESOMA. As mentioned, this topic is quite personal for me. I have spent over 100 days in prison and I still face 25 years in prison for what Human Rights Watch have called was the criminalisation of saving lives. And what's so important is to know that this is pervasive. So after researching European defence and security policy, I decided to utilise my own search and rescue training that I gained as a teenager, and so began coordinating some search and rescue, civilian search and rescue efforts on the southern shoreline of Lesbos, as was already mentioned. As you know, Lesbos is known as a hotspot, as it has been the entry point for over 1 million asylum seekers. And as has been discussed at length already, this so-called migrant crisis is a bona fide humanitarian catastrophe. The Mediterranean is the deadliest sea in the world today. I think UNHCR data shows that there have been over 19,000 people have drowned or are presumed missing in attempting to invoke their human right to seek asylum in Europe since 2014, as Amr already mentioned. And how has Europe responded to this loss of life? The European response has not been to focus on rescuing people in distress, but to view the problem through the prism of criminal networks and anti-smuggling, and to enforce security policy against asylum seekers. I want to be very clear about this. The EU response is foremostly to view people in dinghies escaping conflict as a threat to security, not as a humanitarian tragedy, which must activate their human rights obligations. So again, security and not humanitarianism. And in doing so, the EU response creates a gap in life-saving services through which asylees too easily fall. And at the same time, civilian humanitarian organizations that try to fill this gap are cast as complicit in these criminal activities, or these ostensible criminal activities, and are thus prosecuted or face non-judicial disruption, as was already mentioned. Indeed, our research shows that at least 171 individuals have been prosecuted since 2016 in over 13 European member states. So we have this tendency to focus, and to an extent rightly, on Italy and also Greece, but this really happens in North and West Europe as well. But I will refer to the available data to demonstrate how these prosecutions and the security paradigm that produces them are not merely based on erroneous causality, but are also internally counterproductive. And that is to say, they actually provide impetus for smuggling and do not, in fact, hinder it. So as I mentioned, we have documented over 50 prosecutions of bona fide humanitarian actors in the EU. And these prosecutions really rely on the uncertainty of the EU Directive of 2002, or the Facilitators Directive. And this relates to the crime of smuggling. And prima facie, the charges of smuggling which humanitarians face are consistent with the EU's directive. Nonetheless, they are contrary to the spirit of the discretionary exemption, an exemption that would align with existing humanitarian and maritime laws, but it is often not enforced by member states who prosecute humanitarian action, for example, providing medical assistance or giving out food, warm blankets, and in some heartbreaking cases, even prosecuting people who've let asylum seekers sleep on church pews during storms. And the cases we have analysed have relied on fairly weak evidence of wrongdoing. Allegations, for example, that NGOs are returning dinghies to smugglers in the Central Med, something forensic investigators have often disproved. Charging rescuers with possession of weapons because they had a knife on board, which is basic necessary equipment for cutting ropes in case of an emergency. In my own case, I'm an alleged spy, essentially because I use WhatsApp, this encrypted communications service. And the weakness of these cases is clear from the rate at which they're being dismissed, however long it does take. But if they lose, why are these cases being pursued? And as was already mentioned, this relates to something called the chill effect. So the costly and lengthy cases disincentivize humanitarian action. That's the crux of the issue. And thereby they gut the few rescue operations actually in place. The underlying logic for this is known as the pull factor. Omar already alluded to this briefly. The idea being the more rescue you have in the body of water, the more smuggling will happen in that water. And therefore the logic goes, rescue missions should be stopped. It's an intuitive argument. Basically, the worse we make the conditions for seeking asylum, the fewer people will do so, the better it is. And this is why institutions like Frontex have adopted this logic. I think also the Home Office coined the term. That might not be true. The problem, of course, is that it is not born out of available data. It's not true. There is no correlation, neither positive nor negative, between rescue and movement, which makes sense, as our research already reveals. Evidence of rape and torture experienced by asylum seekers in the Libyan civil war are pushing people into the sea, whether or not medical services are waiting for them or not, or waiting for them. There is, in fact, only one important correlation between rescue and movement. And the more rescue you have, the fewer people end up dying. And that's a really important correlation that we need to focus on. So in sum, the EU focus on securitization is underpinned by a false causality between rescue and asylum, which facilitates the criminalisation of humanitarianism, but at least it tackles the truly painful crimes of smuggling and trafficking, one would think. And I would posit that even on this count, the securitization of our borders is counterproductive, and here's why. It is illegal to be in Europe without the necessary documentation, as we know. It is impossible for most people to receive international protection unless one makes it to the would-be host state, into the territory. Well, this must mean that securitization policy enables criminal networks. When driven from their homes, asylum seekers must use false papers or seek the services of smugglers, as there is no legal way for the vast majority of asylum seekers to make it to safety. So the security logic of the EU is defective on its own terms, and is evidently criminalizing and worse, killing people in the meantime. So before I finish, I want to end by reading you some research undertaken by Forensic Architecture, which is an investigative body that tracks what is happening in the Central Med. This case is known as the Left to Die boat, and I want to really drive the difference between humanitarianism and securitization home. For me, this is really the crux of the debate, and I think it underlies a lot of what we've been discussing. So while I read this, please remember that under international maritime law, there is a humanitarian obligation to rescue a boat in distress. So keep that in your mind as we're reading this. So a vessel left Libya Tripoli at 1 a.m. on the 27th of March in 2011, with 72 migrants on board. At the time, NATO was enforcing an arms embargo in the Central Med. So it is the most highly surveilled and securitized bit of the world, or at least of the sea, so remember that. So at 3 p.m. on that day, the boat was spotted by a French aircraft that transmitted its coordinates to the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Rome. So now we have our first interaction. Now we should have boats coming to the aid of this dinghy in distress. After 15 to 18 hours, the migrants placed a distress call to it by satellite phone, and the vessel's GPS location was determined by 5 that day. So we have our second interaction. Shortly thereafter, the MRCC in Rome signaled the boat's distress and position to all vessels in the area, because it also did so for the NATO vessels in the area. So again, all the military and security ships are now aware of this boat and should be lending assistance. The vessel is flown over by a helicopter. Shortly thereafter, the satellite phone falls into the water. The vessel is approached by several fishing boats. Requests for help are unheeded. A military helicopter flies overhead and drops a packet of biscuits over the side. 5 interactions, no help rendered. At 7 a.m. on the 20th of March, the following day, now they're in Maltese water. Now they're in the search and rescue zone. The vessel runs out of fuel and it begins to drift for 7 to 8 days before it is encountered by another military ship. No assistance rendered. 6 interaction, no help given. They drift until April 10th. Remember, they left on the 27th of March. And when it landed back in Libya, southeast of Tripoli. Upon landing, 11 of the 72 migrants were still alive, and 2 died shortly after that. That is how you secure a border and how you do not live up to your legal obligations. That was in 2011. What has Europe learned since? Nothing but to criminalize those who do fulfill those obligations. Thanks.
Wendy, you're on mute.
Thank you very much to all our fantastic panelists. I think everybody should now have a much clearer overview of what is happening in the southern Mediterranean.